magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworld.eldar.com. I'm Brent, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about the essential and doomed elves that need to appear in pretty much any competitive Eldari list. I'm talking about the Disposables, the pretty cheap units that Eldar autarchs need to bring along to competitive play for scoring secondary objectives in situations in which you know you're going to lose the unit to score the secondary objective, or really inexpensive trading units that under certain circumstances can punch way above their pay grade, and units that just exist for screening or for flipping an objective that you know you're not even going to be able to hold on to score on your own turn, but at least you'll prevent your opponent from scoring it, and whatever it is going to die to do it. And it doesn't matter because it's pretty cheap. These units really are essential in most Eldari lists. Currently, they're fringe units. Like most Eldari lists currently function around a handful of centerpiece units, and then you've got some support units, and you have a couple things in there that are disposable. But it is also possible to build a list almost entirely out of unnecessary individual parts, which is like a non-standard way to play Eldar right now, but it is workable. It's not really something I'm going to talk about in this video, but it's something to bear in mind. And for completely arbitrary purposes, because I have to set the line somewhere, I'm going to say we're going to be talking about the units that I think are most effective in this role for 100 points or less. We're going to talk about especially the value of speed and maneuverability, because typically units that are going to be blockers or secondary scorers need to be fast, or the ability to scout or infiltrate, right? That goes with speed and maneuverability. The relative cheapness of these units compared to one another obviously matters. There's a big difference between a 100-point trading unit and a 50-point trading unit, or a 100-point blocking unit and a 50-point blocking unit. And then also the footprint of the unit. Larger units are better for screening. Smaller units are often better for scoring. There will be other considerations too. Also, this is not predominantly a video about trading, because trading can happen at any value level, right? Like, it's totally appropriate to trade, I don't know, Karen Dross and a bunch of striking scorpions that are all together 100 points, 70 points or something, 170 points, to pull an essential 225 points out of your opponent's list. Like, that's probably a good trade. So we're not broadly talking about trading here. We're talking about what sorts of units you need to think about in this particular role. Pieces that you really don't need. Multi-tools that you can afford to lose. Which ones to select. How to think about playing them. How to incorporate them into lists. Obviously, with the Codex coming pretty soon, the rules for some of these will change, as will some of the points costs. But honestly, I think that these units are probably going to continue to be about as expensive as they are now and still be functioning in this somewhat disposable role, probably. Yes, I know every elf life is precious, and from a narrative point of view, no elves are disposable. But you know what? Sometimes an intelligent farseer does have to dispose of a few elves when they've looked into the future and seen that it's a choice between that and all of the elves. Okay, let's dive in. So I'm going to talk about units that scout and infiltrate. I think that there are that are on foot. I think there are 3 on that list. I'll tell you what they are, and I'll tell you what my favorite is. There's some bike units. I have 3 or maybe 4 on my list here. I have a favorite. I'm going to talk about Hawks and Banshees because I think they're sort of in their own category. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Guardians, and then some like runner-up options. Guardians are exactly 100 points, so they're at the outer edge of what I think makes sense in this role. But they have a massive footprint, which can be really good for screening. And there have actually been some recent changes to the rules for demons, which suddenly I think actually makes Guardians a lot better, which I'll talk about. Okay, let's start with foot scouts and deep strikers. Infiltrators, not deep strikers. There are three pretty cheap units I think that you could potentially have in this role, and they are Striking Scorpions, Rangers, and Corsair Void Reavers. Currently, Striking Scorpions rolling at 65 points, Void Reavers at 60, and Rangers at 55, making these some of the cheapest infantry options available to Eldar, and the cheapest that can get out in front of your army before the game even starts and do the thing. Let's first talk about what the thing is. So the reason to have small units of disposable infantry in the midfield when the game begins, also with a good movement value that can move around and do stuff, is arguably threefold. The first thing that these units can do for you is, especially in the early part of the game, they can help you score secondary objectives that require you to have units in particular places on the board, or to move on to a midfield objective and perform some action, or just perform some action near the center of the table or whatever. And sometimes the secondary objectives that you draw, if you're going to use one of these units, will pretty much require you to give up the unit. But it's totally worth throwing away a 65-point unit for 3 or 4 victory points. You should. So having them for scoring purposes, that's a thing. Another thing that they can do for you is prevent your opponent's scouting units and infiltrating units from starting too close to your own backfield. So when units have infiltrate, they can deploy to the middle of the board, but they have to stay 9 inches from the opponent's deployment zone, and they also have to stay 9 inches from opponent's units. This is also true when completing a scout move. So those of you who are new, scout moves are moves that happen before the first turn of the game. So units that scout start in your deployment zone, but they get to move some number before the game begins, and scout moves are often just the movement value of the model. So like Corsair Void Reavers can scout, and they can scout 7 inches, and that's because they have a movement value of 7. They just get to move once before the game starts. Typically how it works. Generally speaking, Eldari are fragile, and we tend to be an army that we've got some very powerful close combat options, but in general, elves lean a little bit more shooty, and when we do get into melee, we want to be the ones to charge usually. And so having opponents all up in our elf business on the second or even first turn of the game is terrible. And if you position your deep strikers, or your infiltrators first before your opponent positions their infiltrators, you can create these bubbles. So for example, if before the game begins, you look at your opponent's army and you see that they have some units that infiltrate that could potentially be a threat to your soft, elegant but deadly elves, you can screen those out. Right, they've got to stay about 9 inches from your deployment zone anyway. So if you drop your own infiltrating units out of line of sight of the opponent, but about 9 inches from your deployment zone, that creates a further 9-inch bubble. Even a single unit doing this can massively screen out an opponent. And if you have 2 infiltrating units, you can probably keep them away from your backfield entirely, basically just shut down their ability to infiltrate. Sometimes the opponents who are new to the game won't quite realize what's going on here, and it won't even occur to them to try to deploy their infiltrating units until you've deployed yours, and they'll look at the board and they'll be like, oh yeah, there's nowhere to put my infiltrating guys. I guess I won't do that. Really. Similarly, if you can make your scout moves first. So in circumstances where your opponent also has infiltrators, it often makes sense to place these units first. In circumstances in which you actually want your infiltrated units to threaten something or counter something in combat in your opponent's list, like your Striking Scorpions might do this, if your opponent doesn't have infiltrators, then you want to wait, because you want to wait to see where your opponent puts down the thing that they're going to counter. Now, of the 3 foot units that I mentioned, I'm just going to say that I think Striking Scorpions are the best. They're the most expensive at 65 points, and you're paying a little bit more. But unlike Rangers and Corsair Void Reavers, unlike Rangers, they present a legitimate threat. They're actually a threat. Striking Scorpions, I have a unit focus video on them. I'm not going to go through the whole thing now, but Their Manda Blasters in combination with the sheer volume of attacks and the chain sword, and if you give one of the special weapons to the Exarch into any enemy infantry or like bike or cavalry unit, they can really do some work. They have a way to get to devastating wounds. And so not only can they block out your opponent's stuff, but they can counterpunch your opponent's stuff that wants to move into the midfield, maybe knock an enemy off an objective that they try to take in the midfield. And if you're just moving with them on turn one to do an action and sacrificing them to score, at 65 points, it's not a big deal. Also, they're just a little bit more durable than these other options. They have the heavy armor, right? For elves, they have the 3+ save and a 5-up invulnerable because they're aspect warriors. And so if they're in cover doing some action, they're, reasonably robust into small arms fire with no AP or 1 AP and can be kind of annoying to have to get rid of. Rangers, like striking scorpions, can also infiltrate. So they're, true forward deploy units. 55 points, even cheaper, 10 points cheaper when you're dealing with relatively low point values. That's, in terms of percentages and not insignificant percentage cheaper. So if you're just throwing them away to score and using them to block your opponent's ability to get in there, Rangers are the better deal. You're paying 10 more points for Scorpions to be slightly more annoying to eliminate and to have a little bit more of a threat. Like the Ranger long rifle is okay. If the whole squad shoots at some Space Marines, they might kill one, but they're never going to be anything that your opponent actually has to think about or worry about. Whereas sometimes the Scorpions might be. The Rangers also have a 5-up save instead of a 3-up save. They're -1 to hit. They've got stealth, and they've also got a 5-up invuln, but they're just not as, in terms of statistics, they're just not as durable as the Scorpions. So I think paying an extra 10 points for actual combat utility is definitely worth it. And then the Void Reavers, the pirates, they're right in between the two at 60 points. They don't infiltrate. Oh no, but they do scout 7. So they can generally get, if you position them in the front of your deployment zone and you have them run out behind a piece of midfield terrain before the game begins. You generally going to run these things in 5s, and they're, they've got power swords. It's good weapons, right? The squad can put out 10 melee attacks with strength 4 -2 to 1 damage. That's pretty good. But their damage output is not as good as the Scorpions. They have no invuln save. They don't have stealth. They've got the 4-up armor save. I just think it's worth spending another 5 points to have better combat utility and to be able to deploy anywhere in the midfield instead of just making that scout move. And I really want pirates to be good. The models are freaking gorgeous, but I really think Scorpions are the pick here. Okay, let's briefly talk bike options. So the bikes get a little bit more expensive than the disposable infantry options. They have higher toughness, they're much faster, and they have more robust loadouts. So for my money, I think you're looking at Shroud Runners, Wind Riders, or a Viper. Theoretically, you could also run something like a single Autarch Skyrunner, or you could run a Warlock. The Warlock Skyrunner is actually the cheapest option at 55 points. It's as cheap as the Rangers, but it has the mobility of a bike. But I'm very much of the opinion that in this role, you're better off just having a true bike unit, and I'll talk about why. So here's what distinguishes the bike units from the foot infantry. Really, the bike units are more for scoring secondary objectives that require you to move a relatively long distance and then do a thing like an action. And they're better because they're more expensive. They're better at also multi-classing into being damage dealers. They tend to be pretty good crowd control units. And I think the best pick in this role in most lists is Shroud Runners. Shroud Runners are 80 points. They've got their bikes. So they've got a 14-inch move. They scout 9 before the game begins. So not their whole 14 inches, but 9. And I find that, remember the pirates that scout 7 on foot? I find the difference between 9 and 7 to be rather considerable. In a lot of boards and a lot of setups, 9 will get you comfortably, completely behind line of sight blocking terrain in the midfield before the game begins. And 7 often means you're just kind of hanging out there, being a fun target for something on one of your opponent's flanks that's moving forward and just like opening up with anti-infantry fire. Another reason I'm not crazy about the pirates. The Shroud Runners are just in a really sweet place at 80 points in terms of their speed, durability, combat utility, but still being cheap enough to trade and block. As a combat unit, they put out 18 scatter laser shots and 3 Ranger long rifle shots, which do flat 2 damage. And the scatter lasers have a 36-inch range. That's cool. And they can pick a target within 12 inches that they can see in your shooting phase and give everything else lethal hits against it, which is just a really cool ability. But at only 80 points with a 14-inch move and a pre-game move, again, if you need to sacrifice these things in order to max out your secondary scoring, it's okay. If you need to charge forward with them to block some enemy tank's movement and make it only able to move forward, you're not going to do that on turn 1 probably, but like on turn 2, you could be really getting all up in the biz of an enemy tank that's trying to get out of its own deployment zone and just block it. Like you move these things up, they open up with their heavy weapons, they shoot some stuff, and they just keep an important enemy unit out of the game for a turn. Like sometimes that's worth the value of the unit, especially if they're also scoring a secondary. It makes the most sense to use Shroud Runners as something like a blocker when you need to have a unit in that quadrant of the board. So you need something that you're throwing away in any way to score, and then they're going to shoot something and do some damage, and they have a good anti-infantry profile, and they're shutting down an enemy unit, like keeping it out of the game for an extra turn. That is a very efficient use of them. And again, the ability to move around and do actions and do stuff in the midfield, and if they're not really fighting, that's fine too. They're just very efficiently pointed for what they do. And again, of the options in this role, I think that they're the best. Each of the bikes, unlike Wind Riders 2, each of the bikes also has 3 wounds. So the squad has a total of 9 wounds instead of Wind Riders with their 6 wounds. Wind Riders have slightly better armor, but Shroud Runners have stealth, so they're -1 to hit. Now, Wind Riders are also 80 points, and they also have a 14-inch move. And I'm a big fan of Wind Riders. I really like Wind Riders in blocks of 6 or even 9 with guide on them and shuriken cannons led by a Farseer Skyrunner I have a whole unit focus video about it. They can be really, really effective. But I don't love them in this role. I really don't. I think that if you are looking for a cheap trading and scoring unit, the only reason to run Wind Riders instead of Shroud Runners, unless you have a very specific meta that's like, I don't know, all Space Marines, and you really want some shuriken cannons. And even then, I really think the only reason to do it is that you don't own Shroud Runners and you do own a bunch of Wind Riders. And if that's the case, it's okay. But not having the pregame move, not being able to do that, like they're more of a straightforward damage dealer and less of a cool, somewhat disposable toolbox, multi-tool type thing. I also mentioned the Viper. If you're going to run a Viper, I like the Bright Lance and the Viper, and if you're running the what is currently the only option for the detachment, having the reroll to hit and the reroll to wound on the Bright Lance makes it pretty effective into hard targets. It's 5 points cheaper. It also has a 14-inch move. I think that it also can strip cover, which is cool. I think that there are lists that might want a Viper instead of Shroud Runners, and those are lists that are hard target saturation lists. So if you are, for example, if you're running like a triple threat Eldari list where you've got, especially if your third triple threat is not the classic Yvrain and a bunch of Harlequins in a Falcon, but instead you've got like the Avatar of Cain, and you've got a big block of Wraithguard with the Spirit Seer that's resurrecting them, and the Farseer putting Fortune on stuff. And your third triple threat thing is like a Wraith Knight or a second Avatar, like the Incarn. Then you're starting to get into like hard target saturation, at which point running T6 hulls instead of T4 2 wound quick Space Marines, which is really what like something like Wind Riders are, is better. You're creating a situation where your opponent just doesn't have enough of the right kinds of weapons to deal with your hard targets. It's an atypical Eldari build, but if that's what you're doing, Vipers make a lot of sense in this role. Or if you just need a few more heavy weapons, right? The crazy numbers of rerolls on the heavy weapon on the Viper can be really useful. And again, it's cheap enough that if you're just using it to block and score, it's kind of okay. But again, of those bike options, I really do think the Shroud Runners are the way forward. If all you're doing is scoring secondaries, a 55-point Warlock on a bike is cheaper. And maybe a really skillful player could make that work pretty well. I've never seen nobody runs these things. I haven't really seen it done effectively. I would rather cough up the additional 20 or 25 points and have a bike unit that's also like a durable, significant combat threat rather than an easily popped, I give up victory points sometimes for assassination type things, single bike guy. If you really needed something else that was fast and disposable and you could only fit 55 points into the list, maybe. But I think Shroud Runners are the best. I like Shroud Runners and Scorpions, but these other things are usable too. Okay, Swooping Hawks. So Swooping Hawks are getting a little bit expensive for a disposable unit at 85 points, and they've crept up since the beginning of the edition because they are really good and they are about to change. And so I'm not going to talk a great deal about Hawks because we know that they're losing their Skyleap ability when the Codex drops, which is going to change them for sure. Currently, Hawks, which are as fast as bikes, they've got a 14-inch move, also have the ability to, at the end of your turn, go into strategic reserve, and then at the end of your opponent's turn, they can at the end of your opponent's turn, they go into strategic reserve, and then at the beginning of your turn, they come back out of Deep Strike anywhere on the battlefield. So they fly up into the sky and they kind of land wherever they want, and this can be absolutely invaluable for scoring. And Swooping Hawks are trading the durability of the bikes because the whole squad has 6 wounds at T3 instead of at T4, and the bikes have better armor. They're trading durability for more maneuverability, so they're better in that scoring role. Swooping Hawks have reasonably decent fire output against light infantry, but Shroud Runners have better fire output. Nevertheless, the sheer ability of Hawks to move around with Skyleap has up until now made them maybe the most competitive unit, sort of disposable scoring unit for Eldari in this role, maybe. Oh, I just want to throw this out there for anybody who's still living in like 9th edition land. In 10th edition, you may not make an advanced move and still perform an action if you have the assault ability, because it's no longer if you could shoot, you could perform an action. If you specifically says in the rules for the Pariah Nexus deck, and I think it was in the Leviathan deck too, like any sort of matched, serious, competitive or tournament play, you can't, any circumstance in which you would need to perform actions because you're using the cards, you can't advance and do the thing. It doesn't matter if they have the assault keyword. So Skyleap is big, but we know that it's going away in the Codex, so we're not going to worry about that too much right now. Okay, Banshees. Banshees are a 70-point melee screamy runny infantry unit that always fights first with a pretty dangerous melee loadout, and they're slightly faster than other elves on foot. They move 8 inches. And I actually think that Banshees are okay, and they may be the meta may be favoring them ever so slightly more for some reasons. They're a little bit cheaper than the bike units, but a little bit more expensive than the other infantry units. But the fact that Banshees always fight first means that in some matchups they actually can perform a sort of interesting role. If you're worried about stuff that can deep strike within 6 inches of you and then charge, being able to screen your delicate elves with something that's not only kind of disposable, but will carve up anything that tries to get you before that thing can attack can be pretty useful. These are in particular, I think, pretty good into demons, and demons just got this thing, people, whereby one of their stratagems was updated earlier this week, such that they can now, some demon armies can now drop units into an opponent's backfield on turn 2 at 6 inches and then charge, and they don't even need to trigger their Shatter of the Warp. Like, it used to be that demon armies could do this too, like in the midfield after the second turn if they controlled half the objectives, which was usually, but being able to do it in your backfield on turn 2 is pretty brutal, and I think it's going to change the meta a bit. So something like Banshees, it's actually a decent answer, and you're not going to use them as a disposable secondary scoring unit on turn 1, but they're quick enough that if you need to make an advance move with them in matchups where there's nothing else for them to do, you could be then after turn 1 using them as like an action and a scoring unit would be okay. But they're the best melee blocking unit that Eldari have, probably because they fight first, and they have a lot of attacks, and their regular swords are -3 AP, which means pretty good against all armor. They're also good against into the Slaneshi Legion of Excess, which puts out it's an all melee Slanesh build. I made a video about it. Their units put out a ridiculous amount of attacks. They can like reroll all of the hits and all of the wounds. They're super powerful, but they give up fights first on the charge when they do that. And because Banshees fight first, you will always, right? Like they're always a solid answer to Slaneshi demons. So I think they're a little bit niche-y. Probably depends on the meta that you're in, but I do think that they're worth considering in this type of role. But my top picks so far remain the Shroud Runners, the Striking Scorpions, and the Swooping Hawks until the Codex drops in this kind of job. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Guardians, and then I'll talk about some runner-up options for you creative outside of the boxers. Guardians started out the edition overcosted, a little bit underpowered, and their point values have like steadily come down, and other stuff in the Codex has been like nerfed a bit, and we've gotten to the point where Guardians can be pretty good. I've made unit-focused videos about them. I'm not going to go on forever. I think both Guardian Defenders, and the short version is I think both Guardian Defenders and Storm Guardians are good. I think in the right hand and in the hands of a really skilled player and the right meta, with exactly the right setup, they can both be quite good. I think equally good. Guardian Defenders are easier to use. And the biggest reason that I think it makes sense to consider a unit of Guardian Defenders right now is, again, this new demon rule. Suddenly, it's much more important that we can spread out and control our own deployment zones, our own backfields. And when you're up against normal deep strikers, right? Deep strikers that have to stay 9 inches away from you, simply putting your units 18 inches apart makes it impossible for an opponent to deep strike. And incidentally, if you're a relatively new player to the game, screening can mean two things. It can mean screening out deep strikers, that is positioning your opponents, like your models, like 9 inches from the edge of the board and then 18 inches from your other models. So there's nowhere for your opponent to put deep strikers that can really threaten you. And good players will do this. They will always know. And the other thing screening can mean is getting out in front of your army so your opponent's units either can't get to you in melee or just can't move. Like they've got some tank that can only roll forward like 3 inches or something. And Guardian Defenders are maybe the best unit for screening the backfield. A Farseer who's totally out of line of sight, like throwing fortune on things, like that's a good unit. They've got like a deep strike bubble around them. Just by virtue of being a model that's there. Anything with indirect fire is good. But Guardian Defenders are good for this in part because there are 11 models in the squad with the support platform. So they're only 100 points. They can spread out a lot. And in the early game, when they're not fighting yet, probably, they're generating command points for you just by being on an objective. Not command points. Fate dice, of course. But when the Codex drops, we know that they're going to lose their Fate dice ability because Fate dice will no longer be a universal ability for Eldari. We'll go back to having something called Battle Focus, and Fate dice will be a specific detachment ability. So obviously that's not going to be the default thing for Guardian Defenders. They're going to get something new, which is cool, but they'll be just as good at screening as they were before. And if you're going to use them in this role, I think the way to make them worth it is to figure that they're going to be a defensive screening piece in the early part of the game that can also like do actions when you need to do them in the backfield, and maybe lay down some long range fire with a bright lance on a platform that's rerolling hits and rerolling wounds if you're using the current detachment. But in the late game, guardian defenders can be a pretty effective combat unit when your opponent doesn't have a lot of stuff left and they come out into the midfield to play. A unit of 10 guardian defenders can put out a significant amount of shuriken fire, right? Like 18 strength 4 -1 shots, and then like a bright lance that's rerolling hits and wounds is not bad. And they can also be in the late game weirdly durable, because they've got a 3-up save and cover, and you can make them -1 to hit with lightning fast. And if whatever you were putting fortune on with your Farseer is dead in the very late game, throwing it on your guardians when your opponent doesn't have a whole lot left can actually be super annoying. Guardians that save on 3s are -1 because they're in cover, are -1 to hit from lightning fast, and maybe a fortune on them, suddenly are like, unless you can engage them in melee, really difficult to shift when there's not much left on the table. Okay, and as I finish up talking about Guardians here, I am going to take a moment to talk about this video's co-sponsor. Yes, there's a co-sponsor this time, people. All of my videos are sponsored by Constantine, the Magnet Baron, who has a fabulous product. But today's video has a co-sponsor. Adept Roll is a relatively new app for 40K that lets you run math hammer simulations for like any of the units in the game for a variety of tasks. So if you want to know what will happen if your guardian defenders with this or that platform loadout shoot any specific enemy unit in the game, you can get like the math, like what's the average amount of damage, what's the average amount of casualties, how many times am I going to hit, and you can modify it for if they're buffed or if they're not buffed, or if the enemy's -1 to hit or if they're not -1 to hit. And the app can account for things like sustained hits and devastating wounds, and it's all instantaneous. And if you want, you can upload pictures of your models to be next to the things in the app, and it's pretty cool. And the reverse is also true. You can figure out like how survivable your guardians are when they're being shot by the thing. And there's a tournament mode that lets you like preload particular units that you want to be able to check on in particular combos. It's a pocket 40K math calculator that can tell you the averages for just about anything. And if you're trying to decide what you want the loadout of a unit to be, like, do you want to put the scatter lasers or the shuriken cannons on those wind riders? You can see what the average damage output is into a variety of targets based on those choices, which is pretty cool. It's got a reasonably significant number of downloads at this point. People generally seem to like it. And it's full warning, full disclosure. There's a free version, but if you're going to get it, you probably don't. It's worth just getting the paid version. It's around $5 a year or something. It's real cheap. So that's a virtue too. And I will link it in the video description. And I certainly hugely appreciate the sponsorship. So thank you very much to Adept Roll. Okay. I'm going to briefly talk about some other sort of outlier picks, as well as related considerations when it comes to sort of cheap-ish disposable units. Dire Avengers really are almost there. They're 70 points. They're the same amount of the same cost as Banshees, and they have kind of okay shooting output. And they have a bonus on Overwatch, and I think they very nearly get there. I think in earlier editions they could perform actions and still shoot. It would be cool if they could still do that. That might get them there. But I think that they don't infiltrate, they don't scout, they move 7 inches. They're not fast enough. So they kind of struggle to perform secondaries. Their 18-inch range is kind of limited. They're not a big threat. You know, your opponent, and you might say, well, Banshees aren't a big threat either, but Banshees can advance and charge. Like your opponent actually has to worry about a unit of Banshees led by an Exarch with a glaive, or even the twin swords in some matchups. There are certain units that will really mess up, and Avengers don't really mess anything up reliably that your opponent really needs. If you are going to use them, again, 70 points, they're sort of usable in this role. If you are going to use them, I would start them in reserve and figure they can potentially come in on a board edge and help you with some locational scoring or secondary action-based scoring, or they can shoot something and be a threat. But for me, they don't quite get there. I think they need a boost in the Codex. They've continually reduced the points of Shining Spears, trying to get us to use them. They're 90 points. They're fast. They're bike fast, and they're a pretty okay combat unit. But Shining Spears they're a trading unit. They're like something like Shroud Runners scout. Shining Spears don't scout. Shroud Runners have good ranged weapons, so they can skulk around the edge of the board, putting some hurt on an opponent's units and participate in the battle and score secondaries. And Shining Spears kind of want to get in there. Again, you could. They're like Dire Avengers. They're an almost unit. Their damage output has been really good in previous editions, and in this one, it's just not. It doesn't quite justify their expense. They have the maneuverability, but they're not enough of a threat proportional to their cost to not just run Shroud Runners instead, I think, which are more maneuverable anyway because they scout. When it comes to secondary scoring, units that have Lone Operative can do some work for you. I'm going to say not the Death Jester for this, because if you're running a Death Jester, you just want to give it Fate's Messenger and have it be over 100 points. And if it's not, using its ability and shooting, maybe it's doing this for you, but maybe it's a scoring unit, but it's not a cheap disposable unit. I think there's a small chance that at only 70 points, we may be slightly overlooking Illic Nightspear, as he doesn't have Lone Op, but he has an ability that does Lone Op for him or a unit that he's leading. Don't have him lead it gets too expensive. But if you do need something to screen your backfield and perform secondaries or sit on objectives that's untargetable, that's like not really a big deal if you lose him, like potentially Illic, but nobody runs him. It's not a thing. Nobody's doing it. But he's cheap enough that maybe there's a way. The character that I do like in this role, that was popular for a while, 6 or 7 months ago, Troop Masters. Troop Masters are only 55 points, and they've got a fun little melee loadout, and they have the grenade strat, so they can throw grenades and just pile mortal wounds on stuff. I think you only want to take one if you're already running some Falcons, which have 6 seats, but you have units of 5. Like you've got a unit of Fire Dragons and 1 Falcon. Like maybe you have 2 Falcons, and you've got a unit of Fire Dragons with Fugan, and the other one, or you've got a unit of Fire Dragons without Fugan, and the other ones you've got like Karandros and some Scorpions, and there's a seat available. A Troop Master for 55 points, they're pretty quick on their feet, can be a really good grenade, throwy, scory, blocky, disposable, run-aroundy, super cheap disposable-y character unit. Whatever the case, though, you need some units in your list. I think most of us as competitive players, we need some units in our list that we don't need, that are fast enough and cheap enough to block, to score, to bait out an opponent. Like sometimes you want to be able to throw something relatively inexpensive on a midfield objective, not because you plan to be able to keep the midfield objective, but to force some of your opponent's units out into the open to devote resources to targeting the thing, because they just can't afford to let you sit there. Sometimes you can keep a powerful enemy melee unit out of the game for a turn simply by feeding it something while you move something else into position to deal with it, or move the things that it really wants to get to away. Sometimes you don't have to kill the big baddie. Sometimes you just have to make it chew through a unit of Howling Banshees for a turn that are -1 to hit, and have a 4-up invulnerable save in melee. -1 to hit because you use lightning fast to make the -1 to hit. And it's like annoying that your opponent's big demon monster or something just can't quite get through the squad for a turn. They're not going to kill it. They're not really going to hurt it. But a lot of 40K is just about controlling the flow of the game and dictating where your opponent gets to use their resources. and where they have to commit resources. And having units that you don't need enables you to do that more effectively. When I build a list, I generally want to have, ideally I would have like 4 units like this. Often I can only fit 3. And they're all units that can also multi-class into some combat role. Like one of the reasons I like Shroud Runners is that they have a really long range and they're pretty good at shooting. And sometimes that lethal hits ability can be clutch. I also really like Hawks for that reason. And that's why I like Scorpions. That's why my prejudices are in the places they are. Because those are units that in certain matchups and certain circumstances can also play a meaningful combat role in the game in a way that like Rangers never really do. Yes, I know Bernard in Sweden. I'm going to hear the story now about the time your Rangers put 10 wounds on the Silent King, winning you the game or something. They're always outlier examples, but in general, this is true. Some of these units have the ability to regularly play an important combat role, and others don't. And I think that's one of the reasons to lean into them. Mobility is hugely important. Big move values and scout moves, that's huge when it comes to disposable units that are performing these roles. And then I think as the meta shifts, being able to really much more effectively lock down and screen our own backfield can matter. So the big footprint on stuff like Guardians, I haven't been running them, but now I'm thinking like maybe I'm going to have to start leaning that way. 1 unit plus other things to lock out those 6-inch deep strikers in the backfield, and then have things to feed them. Like if they get in, I want them to spend the turn fighting something that I don't need so that I can then counter punch them back into the warp. Not have them all over my Foot Farseer and my D cannons. I'm not running those right now, but you get the idea. Lastly, it is actually possible, I have done this, it's a fun experiment, and you might be surprised how well it works, to build an entire Eldari list out of pretty cheap units, none of which you absolutely need. You've got to go above 100 points, but I have an Ulthway theme list that I built on a lark that's got a bunch of like Warwalkers and Vipers and Guardian units with heavy weapon platforms. And there is a big unit of bikes that I kind of need, but generally I can lose anything in the list and it doesn't really matter. And it's definitely, it's not going to the podium at a GT, but it'll win competitive games at a local club and it's fun to run. And you might have fun. And again, this is not like, I'm not suggesting this for your next GT, but in competitive play, you might have fun as you work the sort of disposable angle. You might have fun trying to construct lists that don't have big centerpieces that you need, right? The Avatar of Cain, the big super buffed unit of bikes, Fugan, the big unit of Wraithguard. Like maybe you see what it's like to build most of a list out of units that are that together are very effective, but there's nothing that your opponent can kill individually that's really going to bother you. It's a very non-traditional way to play Space Elves, which usually rely on like a symphony of overlapping synergies and buffs, and the whole thing works brilliantly well and seems broken right up until the point where you lose one of your clutch units, and then it starts coming apart, which is narratively and tactically how Elves have often played. But you don't necessarily need to build that list because there are over 60 units in the Codex, and that's how this crazy cool hobby works. So those are the basic principles. In their application, they're going to shift massively depending on what you're playing into, what your opponent can do with what he has. But if you're a newer player, learning to think about units as tools, not only for eliminating your opponent's tools, their units, but also for just controlling the flow of the game, for scoring, and like your units are a resource that you're spending to get something done, which can also include just dictating the flow and points. It's important. Okay, so that's what I've got. If you have your own ideas about what you like to include in your lists as possibly kind of doomed chaff that is nevertheless essential, I would love to hear about that in the comments below. If you have any tricks of the trade that you want to share, those are always fun. There's definitely a lot I haven't covered in the video. If there are other units you think that I've overlooked that you want to mention, please feel free. I certainly didn't hit on everything that's under 100 points, just the ones that I thought were most relevant. Or if you just want to say hi to help out the algorithm, that would be cool too. And as always, a special thanks to my patrons who knew this video was coming because when the update dropped, changing the rules for the demon stratagem, I was like, okay, that's it. I'm doing the video about disposables and screening because I think it's going to matter even more now. But I might not be dropping any more tactics videos in advance of the codex. Again, because rules are going to change, I think it's a little silly to be putting a lot of time into talking about how to play with the ones we have, because who knows what we're going to have in just a few weeks' time. But that's it for today. I hope to be back again with something new soon. And until then, best of luck in your next campaign.